Okay. Oh, you should start.
Hello?
Oh, that was loud.
Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to start class right now. So if you guys can open up your laptops. All right. So today, Chris and Grace, two of our TAs, will be teaching. So I'm just going to do some quick announcements and I'll hand off the mic to them.
Oh gosh. Here we go.
Okay, so if we have two homework assignments, homework 1 and 2, those are due both right now if you haven't submitted them yet. Lab 2 will be due on Monday the 20th at 7 p.m. But there will be no lab section or new lab assignment for next week because it's President's Day, so we just want to give you guys a little break. And then homework 3 will be released right after lecture. And this will be due next Thursday. But yeah, I'll just hand it off to Chris now.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about CSS selectors in particular, and also the box model. And so this is going to be, I know we covered a little bit of CSS last week, but we're going to go into a little bit of review of over everything we covered so far, just to give you all a heads up and a refresher. So some reminders about HTML. Head is a special part of the HTML document. You can think of it as your title or copyright page at the front of the book. Essentially, it tells you just little metadata or information that's important for identifying the website, but doesn't really contain any actual content itself. Body is where all your actual content goes. So for example, if we're using our book analogy, this is like the chapters of the book. That's where your content actually goes. And header is a tag for your content, similar to div, but it's a bit more descriptive and meaningful name. So up here, it might contain your title or of your website or navigation bar, things like that. Reminders for CSS. Color refers to text color, whereas background or background color changes background color. Mind blowing, I know. For changing fonts, you can either do it separately. For example, in this case, we've done it. We've specified font size as 18 pixels and font family as Arial, or you can do it together for just using the typical font selector with 18 pixels and Arial in the same line. Remember, this is pretty important. For every line of CSS you write, you must have a semicolon at the end of the line. Otherwise, VS Code will yell at you and tell you that you're doing something wrong. For hover effects, we use this pseudo selector here, where essentially we use a colon and say hover after what we want to select. And that gives us the ability to say, when we put the mouse over this object, we want the color to turn blue. And so that's how you can get some really cool effects in CSS and make your design a lot more responsive to the user, as opposed to just designing it on a screen. So we're going to do some selectors examples. And this is pretty fun because we have this link right here. Am I allowed to click it through this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to do some examples of selectors. On the screen, we have some HTML code and some CSS code. On the left, the HTML pretty much just describes all the text all the content we have on screen. So our list of food places, and our CSS is how we want to modify our selectors. So coming back to this first line of this first CSS selector, we're able to essentially assign CSS attributes to two things at the same time. So as you can see here, we've selected header 1 and list item, so H1 and LI, with the same call, and we want to specify this font family as Arial. So if you go to the HTML here, you'll see that this H1 and any list item, they all have this font family of Arial. If I remove a list item from this, you'll see that that list item is no longer selected as part of the Arial font. And so it defaults to the regular serif font that HTML provides. If I add it back, list items are again selected. So that's how we can essentially, we're able to save some space in our code if we want to apply the same CSS attribute to a lot of things at once. The next example I'm going to show you all is this second part right here. So this hashtag food list li, this is, you'll notice that there isn't a comma in between the two. So what does this line of code actually do? What this selector does is it says, give me every single list item that is a child of anything that has an ID of food list. So if you come over here to the HTML side, you'll see that we have this unordered list tag with an ID of food list. And we have a couple of list items acting as the children of this unordered list, right? And so this selector right here tells us that we want to select all the children of this parent component, or this parent tag with an ID of food list. And so as you can see, all of the list items in this list are colored blue. If I wanted to change it to something else, like red, it would go accordingly. But notice that in my other unordered list that doesn't have an ID of food tag, those colors don't change because we didn't tell the CSS code to change the children of that tag. Similarly, we can also do the other way around. So in this case, we're specifying any unordered list that has children with the class highlight. The difference between class and ID is classes are specified with a period and IDs are specified with a hashtag. So in this case, we want to select any unordered list with a child that has a highlight class. So notice here we have unordered lists with childs that have highlights as a class. And these are the only classes that get highlighted in our output over here. So Taco Bell and Asha Tea House. And lastly, the last example is just the same thing as before, but essentially cafe list, parent, list item, child, we're making all those green. Does anyone have any questions about different ways we can select CSS elements? Cool. How do I get back to the slide? All right. What about on my screen here? Okay. Cool. So going over what we went through on the example there. Yeah, we can select multiple things by separating with commas, as we did in our example. We can select only the list items inside of a parent item. We can select only a class inside a parent unordered list. And yeah, essentially that's kind of all there's a ton of different ways you can mix and match these techniques through CSS selections. It's pretty much up to you how you want to design a certain task or make a certain thing happen. So play around with these techniques. You'll be doing that in your homework for sure this week, and hopefully you'll get a sense of how to mix and manage these selectors in order to really accomplish what you want. Okay, we're going to be talking about the box model now. So yeah, this is something that's incredibly important to CSS. And the CSS box model is really important that a lot of web developers actually get asked about this all the time during interviews. So what's the CSS box model? It's a mental model for how we think about the size of boxes in CSS. What are boxes? Well, boxes are simply referred to any HTML tag, we'll call these elements, that can be thought of as rectangles with a width and a height like a box. And that's actually most HTML elements. So anything that you can think of off the top of your head, like section, div, header 1, header 2, and paragraph, all of these are represented as boxes as seen from CSS. We're going to use these picture frames as an analogy. So content is the picture itself. It's the thing that's actually inside the boxes. So in this case, it's the beautiful pictures inside the frames. In HTML's case, it's like the text inside your paragraph box. Padding, that's that bit of white space that evenly surrounds the content. The padding is sometimes 0, which means it's non-existent, but padding between elements is kind of nice to have, as you might be able to imagine. It gives your content some breathing room, but this is all something that you can change on yourself. Border is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the actual frame in the picture. It's the line that defines the inside of the box versus the outside of the box. And margin, which is the white space that lies outside of the border. And that separates the boxes from other stuff around it. So you might have multiple paragraph elements, multiple div elements next to each other. Margin is the space that defines how much space is between each of these boxes. So in this case, we have 2 paintings, and you can see there's a little bit of white space in between. That's our margin. All of these elements together make up what we call the box model. And they are essentially summarized really nicely right here. Content, padding, border, and margin. Here's what the box model looks like without the analogy. And this is exactly how CSS thinks about boxes. It's actually, this is so prevalent that if you go into inspect elements sometimes on Google Chrome, you'll actually be able to see this when you hover over certain elements. Yeah, this is just one more slide to really get it through, to really emphasize what the box model is. Don't worry if this seems a little unfamiliar at first. I promise you by the time you really get through the end of this class, you'll be thinking about this really easily and know exactly which attribute you want to modify in order to get the result that you want. Okay, let's do a bit more of an instructive example here. So as you can see, this is we have a couple of design issues with the box to the left. It says, welcome to homework 3 will be released tonight. But there's a lot of issues with this, right? There's no spacing, there's no visual hierarchy, we have a lot of low contrast colors, it's hard to read. And so what we can do here is, again, go to our okay. There's a couple of things that I think we could change about this. First of all, we can probably make the background color of our boxes something different to stand out from the boxes itself. So I'm going to go through this like I'm thinking about how to solve the design problem, just the way that you all might have similar thought processes when you go through your own design when you're creating websites on your own. So I think that the background color, I want the text to stand out from the background because it's a little too dark for my taste. So I'm going to set the attribute for background color to white. And as you can see, that immediately changes just the announcement box, just the elements inside the announcement box, to a background color of white. I'm also going to change the the width of this element because I think we don't need the box to go all the way to the end of the screen. We really only need it to cover just the text itself, right? So we're going to change the width to 300 pixels. Cool. I want to give each element inside the boxes a little bit of space, right? So I think I want to separate the 2 items of text, and I want to have a little bit of space, a breathing room between the 2. What's the tool that we can use to create some breathing room between 2 things? Margin's a good one. That's possible, yeah. We can also do something with margin would work. Padding would also work in this case. So in this case, I'm going to use padding. And for a border, I want to define a border for my box. So I'm going to give each of these, I'm going to use a shorthand for this one. I'll go over what all of these traits mean. Yeah, I'm going to define a 10 pixel border. That's not a color. There we go. Yeah, I'm going to define a border to be 10 pixels wide. I'm going to want it to be solid. There's other options for this. And I want the color to be sky blue. So I'm combining 3 attributes into one line, just like how we did earlier in the lecture with font selection. There are other options for the border. You can make it dashed, but in this case, I wanted it to be solid. And here's where I'm going to use margin to really give me some space between the actual elements itself. So for a margin, make it 30 pixels. You'll see what that, whoops. That actually separates the two items itself. So padding, remember, it happens inside of it's between your content and the border itself, whereas margin is actually a separation between multiple elements. So in this case, if I wanted some, like I said, breathing room in between the two elements, that would be padding. If I wanted to actually separate the elements into 2 separate containers, that would be changing the margin. Does that make sense for everybody? Any questions at this point? All right, let's go back to. So as an exercise for us again, we can go over what we just did. So we can identify the content box, the padding, the border, and the margin here. The content box, that's the actual text itself where everything is contained. The padding, that's that white space around that text box. The border is the fancy blue border that we drew around our padding. And the margin is all the space around the border itself that separates this from other elements. We can actually specify different amounts of spacing on different sides of the box. So I didn't do this in the demo I just did up there, but you can actually specify top, right, bottom, and left individual items for each of your traits, whether they're margin, margin, padding, or content itself. And so as you can see, right here, we've done all 4 of the same. But you can actually do different padding on different sides. So in this case, we've set our top to 10, our right to 20, bottom to 30, and left to 40. And that creates a little bit of an offset where the box is actually moved off of not exactly in the center. And the same thing can be done for margin as well. So in margin, we can do essentially the same thing with margin top, right, bottom, or left. But a more neat shorthand is to do this all in one line. So just instead of specifying top, right, bottom, left, it follows the exact same order, top, right, bottom, left on the very bottom, where you can see just a single line of margin, 10, 20, 30, 40 pixels. I don't know why they chose that order specifically. That's just something that the CSS developers decided when they first invented the language, I guess. Okay, let's talk a little bit about units, because I've been saying a lot about pixels or points or other things as well. So what are exactly pixels to begin with? So pixels, they're the tiny squares that make up your screen. 100 pixels is approximately an inch or a little less than an inch. This is good for cases when you want to know, when you know the exact size of something, and you know that the size does not need to scale. For typography, we use points, like 12-point font specifically. But it's 12-point font, it's about, like a point, I think it's about 1/72 of an inch. But that can be inconsistent, so typically we stick with pixels. Okay, I'm going to quickly talk about layout before we hand it off to our design section TA, Grace. But for example, this is a little bit of a design. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about design and the thought process that goes into what really makes good design. So when it comes to thought process about what happens when you go into a design, we really want that main white content container to always be centered on that page and 100 pixels from the top. But here's some questions to ask or consider for yourself. Should the container be a set width like 600 pixels or a percent like 50%? Well, in this case, we would say a pixel width, because something like 50% can be pretty narrow at a smaller screen size. I think all of us are pretty used to interchanging websites between a phone and your computer. But have you ever noticed how your layout on your phone is different from your layout on your website computer? That happens because of a lot of different techniques that we'll cover in the later weeks. But essentially, that percentage value gives you a little bit more flexibility than the pixel value, because your percentage value scales to what the screen that you're looking at. Here's an example of the code that we were using to make that container earlier. So what we needed to make, we wanted to make that white content container. We wanted to be centered, 100 pixels from the top, 600 pixels width, and it has a heading and text. And so this is our CSS that we want to do to accomplish that. We're saying, let's give it 600 pixels of width. We want to make the margin left or right automatic, because that actually helps center the box. And we can specifically modify the margin top to be 100 pixels from the top. Yeah, so one thing to note, I think it's a really common joke in web developer circles that nobody remembers how to center a div. And so if you, I Google that all the time. And so this is one thing to remember. If you have a width set, then you can actually use margin auto to center an item. So whether that's a division, whether that's a div, whether that's something else, this will help you figure out how to get something exactly in the center. How do we put stuff next to each other? So by default, a lot of HTML items like div spans as wide as it can across the page. Each new division goes on its own line. And sometimes we want stuff full width, but sometimes we really want to create layouts where boxes can be side to side, just like on this slide. How do we do this? Well, we can specify using this attribute called display. And display allows us to, there's 3 examples here that there are more commands, but these three are what we'll go through today. Display block, everything goes on its own line, no matter the width, and you can use margin and padding. So for example, div, h1, paragraph, these are all by default display using display block. If you choose to set display to inline block, you're going to be able to use stuff to go on the same line. And you're actually able to still use define margin and padding. If you use display inline, everything is on the same line only as long as the text inside it is. But this does not really respect margin or padding. It doesn't really allow you to change its attributes and customize that essentially. And so we really like using the middle if it's a really happy medium, because stuff goes on the same line and you're still able to customize margin and padding itself. An example of things that do not respect margin or padding are by default are span and hyperlinks. Okay, so display, like you can see, this inline block command is what allows us to put things on the same side. And that float attribute is what tells our CSS if we want things to be left aligned or right aligned. In this case, we want things to be left. So that float really allows us to help set essentially an alignment for our boxes. Okay, let's talk about thinking about layouts in general. So think of a page as building blocks put together. This is the Facebook home page. If you want to break this down into what the building blocks of this website look like, essentially, we have a header bar by itself. We can tell its fixed position. It sticks to the top. When you scroll, you're always able to see it. And there's a main content container that has a set width. It's centered in the middle of the page. Yeah. On the actual main content page, we can take a look at what actually happens, what's actually contained inside that main content container. Like I said, think about this as blocks. So before I flip the screen to the next slide, think about how you might segment this web page to how you might consider blocks to be segmented into this text and into this web page. So we're going to start a little, before going too deep, we're going to start by segmenting a left block and a right block. So a left column, this section is just going to contain our sidebar, like our title, our set of links, our search bar. We want to separate that from the rest of our content. And then our right column has a lot of stuff. So let's keep breaking this down. This, the red box, that's one row that contains our large header, like our large image to maybe our cover photo. And this is another row inside that column with more columns and rows inside. So essentially you can keep going and break things down even further. If we want to focus on just this box, we can, again, divide this into columns, each of which have distinct blocks of content. There's a text field to make a new post. There's alerts, there's actual posts themselves. And we haven't even completely broken down each of those individual columns either, but you can probably tell that you can break those down even further. So individual posts are probably their own block. On the right column, that image of your friends, that's also a block itself. So really, you really want to think about when you build a web page as a bunch of building blocks put together. That collapse, I want to say the word recursively, but that's not really like a great word to use. Essentially, boxes upon boxes inside. Let's talk about some quick tools that you can actually use when you are building your website on your own, or if you are trying to complete homework. You have these things called Chrome development tools, specifically Inspect Element. Now, you might have played with this as a kid just to be like, haha, I hacked the website. I'm so funny. But we'll just quickly go over how to actually use these tools just for everyone's reference. This is a really good way to actually debug and figure out what's going on with your code. It works obviously best in Chrome. It's decent in Firefox, not really that great in other browsers. The ways to get to it, you can right click and inspect element, or you can Control-Shift-I. And I believe F12 also works in some cases. When you press the inspect element, you're essentially going to be able to go into, you'll see this screen, and you're able to, your HTML, CSS elements are separated into tabs. So make sure that you are on the element tab. This is your HTML. You can kind of click on arrows on the left to hide or expand elements. And when you click on an element for an HTML, you can see the CSS of that element from your left panel. You can double click anything to edit the CSS and see how it would actually affect your page. But remember that any edits made here don't actually happen in your index.html file. So if you do want to actually make that change, you do have to make that change on your HTML file itself. Okay, some things you can do with the inspect element, you can hover over HTML tag and it will show you that box model diagram of that element that we just talked about. So that its width, its height, its padding, its margin, etc. You can click on the HTML tag and you see what CSS rules are affecting it. You can click on a CSS property value and change the CSS and see what happens. And you can click in the CSS rules area, add CSS to a specific HTML tag you're on, and see the changes happen live as you're working. Okay, some common patterns in layout structure. Yeah, so hopefully by now you've noticed there's some common patterns in our homeworks and labs. For the very overall structure of the page, there's usually a header and a main container in the page that holds everything. The header might be separate since it's a block of its own. It might be locked to the top of your screen. Even if it's not obvious, you can probably distinguish an area where all the content is. And so just as we saw in the Facebook example, we think of things as columns. And in each column, there are distinct sections, like posts or lists of links. And these are called components. These components aren't really positioned in columns. They just fill up the space one by one. And when we have two columns, we need a div to hold both of them and put them next to each other. And so that box of boxes, that's usually what we call, we usually use divisions or divs to do that. And as we saw in the example, there are columns and rows and columns and rows and columns in a big container. And so complex looking things, really, I think I want to emphasize this, complex looking things are really just simple things combined. So you start from simple components, you piece together them in rows and columns, and you really get, that's how you're able to make complex layouts. Are there any questions about the content that we just covered? Yeah, what's up?
So let's say I have like two screens. One is both like of an inch diagonal.
Yeah.
One is like, let's say 1080p resolution, and one is like double this resolution. If I specify my offset, let's say 600 pixel margin.
Yeah.
That like will it respect the pixels on the screen?
So yeah, essentially it's when the CSS, when you use pixels, like specific counts, you're telling like every single browser that looks at your that looks at a website, right? It knows like how big your browser window is. So if you're looking at it on your first screen, your browser knows how big that window is, right? And if you specify it by pixels, it will display exactly that many pixels. So something that's 600 pixels wide on your smaller screen is going to look bigger than something that's 600 pixels wide on your bigger screen.
Encounter that on the website. Sometimes on apps, I encounter that with
Yeah, so the reason you don't encounter that is because web developers work really hard at making that experience seamless from screen to screen, right? So if you want to try it yourself on your own homeworks or your own assignments, try defining a specific box of a certain size, right? And open them up on the two different screens. If you specify specific size, they will look different because of your other screen is big, right? But web developers in general work really hard to make sure that either their content is customized to all the different possible screens that you have, which sometimes doesn't work, or is generally flexible enough to appear similar enough no matter what screen you're using. And so that's the main difference between percentages and pixels. So percentages, you can actually specify something to take up 50% of the space on the screen rather than a certain size. And then in that case, you'll always have some kind of content take up half your screen, regardless of how big your screen is. All right, I'll hand it off to Grace to talk about design.